Thank you very much, Commissioner Gomez, and thank you for being here today. And don't forget to take that brochure, because somebody went through a lot of trouble of getting things right for such a short piece of writing. There's a lot of good information in there, so don't miss out on taking the brochure. As a matter of fact, it stole some of my thunder. So I would like to address this morning a couple of things, because I was listening to the introductions and it struck me that I speak to a lot of groups about the importance of education. And lately, I have been stressing the fact that our history, an honest history, a history that includes both the good and the bad, the successes and the failures, that includes the roles of very different peoples at different times in different ways, is the foundation of our society. It is the essence of citizenship. You cannot be a good citizen unless you have a good understanding of the history of the society to which you belong, just as you cannot be a good member of a family unless you understand the history of that family, who the members of the family are, what functions they have, where they came from, how you got to where you are at any given point. And we all have black sheep in our families. We all have successes and failures in our families, and in the broader society, it's the same. So our history should reflect that honesty, confronting the difficult, confronting those places where in the past perhaps we did not behave as a society the way we would like to think the better part of us would do things today. And so as that starting point, let me say that the history of Texas, which really begins in the 1690s, it's the first recorded visit to the Travis County area. A man named Terán de los Ríos led an expedition through this area on his way toward East Texas. He had a specific assignment from the Viceroy in Mexico City, and that was to make sure that there weren't any pesky Frenchmen in the area trying to usurp Spanish sovereignty in the area. He got up to East Texas. He wandered around rather aimlessly, as a matter of fact, through the Sabine River country and into the Red River country and out into what is today western Louisiana. And he didn't find any pesky Frenchmen, so he withdrew. And in 1693, the Spanish, perhaps making their way back through the Travis County area, returned to the interior of Mexico, there not being a threat to Spain's claim that Texas was part of New Spain, which is what colonial Mexico was called. And I start there because one of the things that the Spanish didn't realize is, and one of the things that subsequent European societies didn't realize, is the vibrancy of the indigenous societies that lived in and around Travis County. Their worldview was very different from their European successors and their Euro-American successors. They didn't have land titles. They didn't write. They didn't make surveys and put up markers of who owned what property, which has left us a very rich legacy at the General Land Office, at the County Clerk's Office here in Travis County. It's a wonderful history to read. But there's that lost story of these indigenous peoples, Tonkawa, Apache, later on in the 18th century, Comanche, Wichita, and others, who are entirely lost to history, and for whom only an archaeological evidence of their passing remains. But in and of itself, that archaeological evidence tells us that there were previous owners of Travis County. And it is important for us to recognize that European and European Americans, whether they were Spanish or French in some areas, not in Travis County, but in some other parts, or English or American, wherever, they were in fact, usurpers. They came and they replaced the people and the societies that were in place. And we can't take that back. We can only try to understand it, and we can try to make sense of it, and we can try to incorporate those experiences to the best of our ability into that history so that we can be honest about our history. We can understand that interplay among societies and between societies. And it isn't any difference in Travis County than it is in the rest of the world. The course of human history has always been one group, one society, one culture, one civilization replacing another. And in Travis County, it so happened that the Spanish ruled. But the Spanish didn't settle. The Spanish came through in 1691, perhaps back in 1693. In 1730, for a small period of time, down near today, what is Zilker Park, 3 Spanish missions that had failed to gain the support of Indian tribes in East Texas established themselves temporarily near Barton Springs. And who wouldn't want to establish themselves near Barton Springs? And they carried out their missionary activity for a few months before withdrawing to San Antonio, and in fact becoming the 3 East Texas missions that became a permanent part of San Antonio's mission chain today. So in a way, Travis County shares a little bit of its history with Bexar County and the missionary experience of the Spanish colonial period. The most important reason why the Spanish didn't settle in this area was that Texas for the Spanish remained essentially a buffer against the French, a buffer against Indian tribes that would raid what Spain considered more valuable territory to the south, the mines, the silver mines of northern Mexico, the rich agricultural valleys in the areas of Saltillo and Durango. And so for Spanish officialdom, Texas really only fulfilled a military, a geopolitical function. The people who were assigned to live in Texas and who made their homes here nevertheless became the first modern Texans. They identified with Texas. They lived in San Antonio. They lived down in what is now Goliad. They lived in East Texas. Actually, I like to tell my students, if you want to visit the first capital of Texas, you have to go to western Louisiana, because the first capital of Texas is now a Louisiana State Historic Site. It's called Los Adais, and it's just outside Robeline, Louisiana. So you can blame the United States for stealing the most eastern portion of Texas. In 1819, by treaty, Spain gave up everything between the Sabine River and Natchitoches, Louisiana, and therefore the first Spanish capital of Texas wound up in Louisiana. But nevertheless, in these 3 places, there was a Spanish Texas population, and there were generations of Tejanos born. Between 1716 and 1821, 5 or 6, sometimes 7 generations of Tejanos, people who called Texas home, people who identified with Texas, began to feel that this place belonged to them. Now, I don't have the time to get into it very much, but they were settlers. They weren't just soldiers. They weren't just missionaries. They weren't just the Indians who were Hispanicized by the missionaries. They were actually businessmen. They were artisans. They were government officials who felt that Texas was their future. However, because there were so few, because Texas was such an unattractive destination for settlement. In fact, one of the Spanish governors of Texas, a man named Domingo Cabello, wrote after he got to Texas that he had lost his cook, who he had acquired in Spain and brought to Nicaragua, where he had been governor before he was assigned to Texas. And as soon as they got to Mexico City, the cook had left his service because everybody had told him these stories about how the natives would eat him. And so he was unwilling to come to Texas. And I think people in Nebraska might feel the same way this weekend. He came to Texas saying that coming to Texas was worse than going to Siberia or Lapland. A very different view of Texas than subsequent people would hold. But the people who lived here, the Tejanos, those first Spanish settlers of Texas, nevertheless built ranches, they built farms, they built communities, they established the European and Euro-American presence, which sometimes in conflict, sometimes in coexistence, allowed Texas to be shared between its natives, its indigenous people, and these Spanish settlers, mostly of Mexican heritage, and many of them mixed blood. They were a mixture of Indian and European, who came to see themselves as Texans. And in 1821, they faced the reality that the future of Texas could not be its past.